May 15, 1944. Camp Sheridan, Illinois. The morning sun cast long shadows across the barbed wire perimeter as Oberleutnant Friedrich Müller and 20 other German prisoners of war waited in formation. For months, these captured soldiers of the Wehrmacht had heard rumors about what lay beyond the camp's gates. Today, under the watchful eyes of American guards, they would see it firsthand. What Müller and his comrades would witness in the coming hours would shatter their most fundamental beliefs about the war and their homeland's chances of victory. Their entire understanding of Germany's military and economic might was about to collapse in the most mundane of American settings, a local supermarket. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is a story of how the simple abundance of American consumer goods became one of the most effective psychological weapons of World War II, revealing to captured German soldiers a truth that would take their homeland years of devastation to finally accept. Captain Robert Wilson of the 33rd Military Police Battalion adjusted his uniform as the prisoners lined up. At 43, Wilson was a World War I veteran now tasked with managing German POWs being put to work in America's heartland to compensate for labor shortages. Wilson had advocated for this particular excursion, convinced that exposure to American civilian life could accomplish what interrogation often couldn't. Gentlemen, he addressed the prisoners through Staff Sergeant Hans Gerhardt, a German-American interpreter. Today you'll be assisting with inventory and restocking at Harper's Grocery in town. You will maintain proper behavior at all times. Any attempt to escape will result in immediate disciplinary action. Müller, a 28-year-old former engineering student from Hamburg who had been captured in North Africa during the collapse of the Afrika Korps, translated Wilson's words for his fellow prisoners. Privately, he scoffed at what he considered transparent American propaganda. Since their capture, the Germans had been shown films of American factories and farms. Müller, like many, dismissed these as elaborate stagecraft, skillfully produced fictions designed to demoralize them. Just another Potemkin village, he whispered to Feldwebel Werner Schmidt, a hardened 32-year-old veteran from the 21st Panzer Division. They'll probably have actors pretending to shop in an empty store. Schmidt nodded slightly. The Americans waste film like they waste ammunition. All show, no substance. The prisoners were loaded onto 2 canvas-covered trucks for the 12-mile journey into town. Sitting on wooden benches, they watched through gaps in the canvas as the American countryside rolled past. Endless fields of corn and wheat that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Even this abundance of farmland was difficult for the Germans to reconcile with their understanding of the world. Unteroffizier Dieter Kaufmann, a 25-year-old former baker from Munich, leaned toward Müller. "Look at those fields," he said quietly. "No one is working them. How can they produce anything without labor?" "It's mechanized," replied Müller, who had spotted combines in the distance. "One machine does the work of 50 men." Schmidt snorted. "So they claim. The Reich has the most advanced technology in the world. These are just for show." The convoy arrived at Harper's Grocery, a modern single-story building with large glass windows and a parking lot half-filled with civilian automobiles. The prisoners were ushered out and lined up again as Captain Wilson explained their duties. Some would help unload delivery trucks, others would stock shelves, and a few would assist with inventory. For Müller, assigned to help unload delivery trucks with Schmidt and 4 others, the first shock came immediately. The delivery truck that pulled up was not military but civilian, a massive Chevrolet with Eastern Grocery Supply painted on its sides. The American driver, a heavy-set man named Earl Jenkins, greeted them casually, seemingly unbothered by working alongside enemy soldiers. "Got a full load today, boys," Jenkins said cheerfully. Usual Thursday delivery. When the truck's rear doors swung open, Müller froze. The vehicle was packed from floor to ceiling with food, not military rations, but civilian goods. Canned fruits, vegetables, coffee, sugar, flour, and meat. Schmidt stood beside him, his usually stoic face betraying confusion. "This cannot be real," Schmidt muttered. "It must be props." Müller reached for a nearby crate of canned peaches. The weight was authentic. He examined the label. The production date was just 2 weeks earlier. As they began unloading, the sheer volume became undeniable. This was more food than they had seen in one place since before the war, and it was only one delivery to one store in one small American town. Inside the store, Unteroffizier Kaufmann faced his own revelation. Assigned to stock shelves in the dairy section, he stood transfixed before a refrigerated display case filled with butter, real butter, not the ersatz substitutes that Germans had grown accustomed to since 1939. Beside it sat wheels of cheese, bottles of milk, and cartons of eggs. "How much is ration per person?" Kaufman asked the American clerk supervising him, a middle-aged woman named Dorothy Campbell. She looked at him quizzically. "Rationed? Oh, butter was rationed last year, but not anymore. Folks can buy what they need now. What they need, not what they're allowed." Kaufman clarified, certain he had misunderstood. "Well, there's still limits on some things, sugar, meat, coffee. But dairy's pretty much back to normal," she replied, handing him a crate of milk bottles. "These go on the bottom shelf, please." Kaufman worked mechanically, his mind racing. In Germany, butter had been strictly rationed since 1939, with most civilians receiving barely 125 grams per week, when it was available at all. Here, Americans could simply purchase what they needed. At the meat counter, Gefreiter Heinrich Brandt, a 22-year-old former butcher's apprentice from Frankfurt, experienced a similar shock. Assigned to help the store's butcher prepare cuts for display, he found himself handling more beef in one morning than most German civilians would see in a year. When the American butcher, Sam Kaplan, casually trimmed fat from premium cuts and tossed it aside, Brandt nearly protested at such waste. "In Germany," Brandt said carefully, "we use every part. Nothing is wasted." Kaplan nodded amicably. "Sure, we do too. The trimmings go to make hamburger. But with the ranches out west running at full capacity, we've got more than enough." "Say, you were a butcher back home, right? What cuts are popular in Germany?" Brandt struggled to answer. The question presupposed a reality that hadn't existed in Germany for years: civilian choice in meat cuts. By 1944, most Germans received less than 100 grams of meat per week through ration cards, and the specific cut was irrelevant. You took what was available or went without. The most profound realization came when Muller, having finished unloading, was assigned to help with inventory in the store's stockroom. Here, away from what he still suspected might be a staged display for the prisoner's benefit, he discovered the unadorned truth. Row upon row of shelves reached from floor to ceiling, stacked with canned goods, flour, sugar, and other staples. This wasn't for show. It was routine backup stock for a single store in a town of 8,000 people. Working alongside him was Private First Class Michael Novak, a 19-year-old who had been deemed unfit for overseas service due to asthma. As they counted inventory, Novak chatted amiably about mundane American life. "My mom says it's getting easier to get most things now," Novak remarked. "Last year was tougher with rationing, but production's way up. They say we're making enough not just for our boys overseas, but for the Allies too." Muller paused, a clipboard in his hand. "How much food does America send to England and Russia?" Novak shrugged. "Tons. Literally tons. My uncle works at the shipyards in Chicago. Says they're sending out Liberty ships full of food and supplies every day. Just endless." The casual way Novak delivered this information hit Muller harder than any propaganda film could have. This wasn't boasting. It was simply stating a fact so ordinary to the American that he found it barely worth mentioning. Muller recalled the severe rationing in Germany, where civilians had endured years of decreasing rations. In 1943, the official weekly ration in Germany included only 280 grams of meat, 110 grams of fat, 1,650 grams of bread, and 210 grams of sugar, and even these meager allowances were often unavailable. Factory workers received slightly more, but the entire German population had been on a subsistence diet for years. By midday, the prisoners were permitted a lunch break. Captain Wilson had arranged for them to eat in the store's small break room rather than returning to camp. The meal was simple by American standards: sandwiches with roast beef, cheese, lettuce, and tomato, served with potato chips and cola. To the Germans, it was a feast. Feldwebel Schmidt sat rigidly, barely touching his food despite obvious hunger. "This is exceptional treatment," he stated flatly, "not representative of real conditions." Kaufman, however, could no longer maintain such denial. Between bites of his sandwich, he said quietly, "My sister wrote last winter that they hadn't seen real coffee in Frankfurt for 2 years. Here, I counted 15 different brands on the shelf. And the vehicles in the parking lot," added Brandt. "All civilian. In Berlin, only military and party officials have gasoline." The conversation halted as they noticed Mrs. Campbell, the clerk, entering the break room. Instead of reporting their conversation, she smiled and placed a freshly baked apple pie on the table. "Made this last night," she said warmly. "My boy's fighting in Italy right now. I figure his daddy didn't raise him to let anyone go hungry, even if you boys are on the wrong side of this thing." She cut generous slices and placed them on plates. The unexpected kindness created a palpable tension. According to everything they'd been taught about America, its greed, its materialism, its hatred of German culture, this woman's act was inexplicable. Schmidt stared at his plate, a conflict visible on his face. "Thank you," Muller said finally, his English heavily accented but clear. Others mumbled similar thanks, except for Schmidt, who remained silent. After lunch, the prisoners returned to their duties. Throughout the afternoon, they witnessed a steady stream of ordinary American shoppers, women with children, elderly couples, workers on break, all purchasing groceries with a casualness that seemed surreal to the Germans. These weren't wealthy elites or government officials. They were ordinary citizens with access to resources that had become distant memories in wartime Germany. At one point, Muller observed an elderly woman complaining to the manager about the quality of last week's apples. The manager immediately apologized and offered a refund or replacement. In Germany, such an interaction had become unthinkable. You accepted what was available without complaint, or you went without. As the day progressed, the psychological impact on the prisoners became increasingly evident. Some, like Schmidt, retreated into stony silence, while others became more talkative, asking questions about American production and distribution. The Americans answered openly, without the secrecy that might suggest propaganda. Private Jenkins, the truck driver, explained to Muller during an afternoon cigarette break, "Buddy, this ain't even a big store. You should see the supermarkets they're building out in California. Big as airplane hangars with 20 registers. Friend of mine works construction on one in Los Angeles. Says it's got its own parking lot for 300 cars." By 5 p.m., as the prisoners prepared to return to camp, the accumulated evidence had become impossible to dismiss. This wasn't a Potemkin village constructed to fool them. It was simply America. The abundance wasn't staged. It was routine. Most devastating of all, it wasn't even considered remarkable by the Americans themselves. On the truck ride back to Camp Sheridan, the mood among the prisoners was subdued. Even Schmidt sat in uncharacteristic silence, his earlier skepticism apparently exhausted. Kaufman leaned toward Muller and whispered, "If this is how they feed civilians in a small town, what must their armies be receiving?" Muller had no answer. He was calculating industrial capacity in his head, trying to reconcile what he had witnessed with what he had been told about American production. If one small-town store received such deliveries regularly, and there were thousands of similar towns across America, the scale of production was almost incomprehensible. That evening in the barracks, the experience became the sole topic of conversation. The 20 men who had visited Harper's Grocery tried to explain what they'd seen to their fellow prisoners, many of whom reacted with the same skepticism they themselves had shown that morning. "It's not possible," insisted Lieutenant Carl Weber, who had remained at camp. "America has 130 million people. They cannot all shop this way." "I counted the inventory myself," Muller replied. 500 cans of beef, 600 of vegetables, 8 varieties of bread baked daily. And the manager said their deliveries come 3 times weekly. Schmidt, who had maintained his silence since returning, suddenly spoke. "My father was a statistician for Krupp Steel. Before the war, he traveled to Detroit to study American manufacturing methods." He paused, his voice lowering. "He told my mother afterwards that if America ever mobilized fully, Germany could not match its production. The party officials reported him for defeatism. He was warned never to make such statements again." The barracks fell silent. Coming from Schmidt, the Wehrmacht's true believer, this admission carried special weight. The changes in the prisoners' attitudes became apparent to the American guards over subsequent days. Captain Wilson noted increased cooperation and a marked decrease in disciplinary issues, particularly among those who had visited the store. When a new work detail to Harper's was announced a week later, there were more volunteers than positions available. For Mueller, the revelation extended beyond food and consumer goods. During his second visit to the store, he engaged in conversation with the manager, Richard Harper, a man in his 50s who had lost a leg at Below Wood during the previous war. "How does your store receive information about what to order?" Mueller asked, genuinely curious about the logistics. Harper showed him a complex ordering system based on inventory records and seasonal projections. "We track what sells week by week, adjust for holidays and seasons, and place orders accordingly. The distribution center in Chicago coordinates deliveries across 8 states from one central warehouse. And this is a private business? Not government-controlled. Private as they come," Harper replied. "Been in my family for 25 years. Government sets some prices during wartime, and we handle the ration coupons. But otherwise, we run it how we see fit." This glimpse into American commerce revealed something even more fundamental than abundance. It showed a system built on information flows, consumer choice, and decentralized decision-making. In Germany, the Reich had increasingly centralized all economic decisions, creating inefficiencies and bottlenecks that no amount of dedication or sacrifice could overcome. As spring turned to summer, the impact of these revelations spread throughout Camp Sheridan. The prisoners who worked in town returned with stories that contradicted everything the Reich had told them about America. They described factories running 3 shifts, farms with mechanical harvesters that could do the work of 50 men, and transportation networks that moved goods efficiently despite wartime restrictions. 4 men trained to believe in German technical and organizational superiority. These observations required a complete re-evaluation of reality. Some, like Schmidt, retreated into silence. Others, like Kaufman, began asking to learn English, ostensibly to communicate better during work details, but increasingly to understand this confounding nation. In July 1944, news of the attempted assassination of Hitler reached the camp. The prisoners' reactions were mixed. Some expressed outrage, others quiet approval, and many simply confusion. But among those who had witnessed American abundance firsthand, there was a growing sense that Germany's cause was not merely morally questionable, but practically unsustainable. Mueller, whose engineering background gave him a framework for analyzing what he had seen, began keeping a journal of observations. On July 25, 1944, he wrote, "If one extrapolates from Harper's grocery to the nation as a whole, America's productive capacity exceeds Germany's by a factor of at least 10. Their agriculture appears to operate with minimal manpower, yet produces surplus. Their transportation system moves goods without apparent strain despite wartime conditions. Most critically, their production does not seem directed primarily by the state, but functions through some combination of market mechanisms and distributed decision-making. I am forced to conclude that the Reich's leadership has fundamentally miscalculated. We were told America was soft, decadent, inefficient, a nation of gangsters and movie stars incapable of mobilizing for total war. What I have witnessed suggests precisely the opposite. Their apparent decadence, the consumer goods, the private automobiles, the endless variety of foods, is not weakness but the visible evidence of overwhelming industrial might. If America can feed its civilian population this way, while simultaneously supplying its own military and its allies, Germany cannot achieve victory through any conceivable military strategy. The war was lost before it began. Mueller's journal, discovered after his death in 1986, provides one of the most insightful contemporary accounts of how German military confidence collapsed among POWs in America. While figures like Albert Speer would later write similar analyses of Germany's fundamental miscalculation regarding American productive capacity, Mueller and his fellow prisoners came to this realization years earlier, standing in the aisles of a small-town grocery store. The story of Camp Sheridan's prisoners became part of a larger pattern. Throughout America, approximately 372,000 German POWs held in camps from 1943 to 1946 had similar encounters with American abundance. These experiences helped shape Germany's post-war relationship with the United States, as thousands of former POWs returned home with first-hand knowledge of American society and economy. For Friedrich Müller, powerful revelations at Harper's Grocery forever transformed his understanding of the war and his own country's future. After repatriation in 1946, he would use his engineering degree to join the rebuilding of West Germany, bringing American-inspired production methods to a Volkswagen plant in Wolfsburg. In his later years, he frequently credited his experiences as a POW with giving him both the knowledge and motivation to contribute to Germany's remarkable economic miracle. The American system wasn't just about abundance, Muller would later explain to his colleagues at Volkswagen in 1958. It was about information flow, decentralized decision-making, and consumer feedback. The grocery manager knew what would sell because he tracked purchases, not because some central authority told him. This was the real revelation. The impact of American agricultural efficiency particularly affected those prisoners like Heinrich Brandt, who came from farming backgrounds. Upon returning to his family's small farm outside Kassel in the American occupation zone, Brandt immediately began implementing techniques he had observed while working with local Illinois farmers during his captivity. "My father thought I had lost my mind," Brandt recalled in a 1977 interview for the German Economic Miracle Oral History Project. "I kept talking about crop rotation, mechanization, and fertilizer applications based on soil testing. These were common practices in America, but seemed revolutionary in our village. When I described the size of American farms and their yields per hectare, many simply refused to believe me." The personal connections formed during these work details also had lasting impact. Dorothy Campbell, the clerk who had shared her apple pie with the prisoners, maintained correspondence with Dieter Kaufmann for nearly 30 years after the war. When Kaufmann's bakery business expanded to 5 locations across Munich in 1965, he named his signature apple pastry Dorothy's American Pie in her honor, creating a lasting tribute to unexpected wartime kindness. "She showed me kindness when I was her enemy," Kaufmann explained in a 1970 interview with Der Spiegel. "This taught me something profound about America that no propaganda could convey. Their material abundance was impressive, yes, but their capacity for personal generosity despite the war. This was equally remarkable." Dieter Kaufmann returned to Munich and eventually reopened his family's bakery, incorporating American mass production techniques to create one of the first bakery chains in post-war Germany. Werner Schmidt's story took a different turn. Upon repatriation, he retreated to his family's farm in Saxony, which fell under Soviet control. His subsequent fate remains unknown. One particularly poignant episode occurred during the prisoner's third visit to Harper's Grocery in August 1944. As they worked, news arrived of the Allied landings in southern France. The American staff grew excited, discussing how the war might end within months. Richard Harper, the store manager, noticed the German prisoners listening and fell silent, creating an awkward moment. Later that day, Harper approached Muller as he organized a display of canned goods. "I didn't mean to celebrate in front of you boys," he said quietly. "That wasn't right of me." Muller was struck by this unexpected courtesy. "It is war," he replied simply. "Your side is winning. This is natural." Harper considered this, then said something Muller would remember for the rest of his life. "The way I see it, the sooner this war ends, the sooner you get to go home and see your family. And the sooner our boys come home too. That's worth celebrating on both sides, isn't it?" This perspective, that Americans viewed the end of the war not primarily as victory but as peace, contradicted the Nazi portrayal of Americans as vindictive and bloodthirsty. It suggested a fundamentally different relationship to the conflict itself, one that saw war as an aberration to be resolved rather than a glorious national endeavor. The educational impact of these experiences extended to American guards and civilians as well. Captain Wilson documented the changing dynamics in his monthly reports to Army headquarters. In September 1944, he wrote, "The integration of German POWs into local work details has produced unexpected benefits beyond labor utilization. Local civilians report gaining more nuanced perspectives on the enemy, while guards observe that prisoners who work in town show markedly improved morale and compliance. Most significantly, The exposure of prisoners to American civilian life appears to be accomplishing what formal re-education programs have not: a fundamental reassessment of National Socialist claims regarding American society. Captain Robert Wilson's experiment in showing German prisoners American abundance achieved far more than breaking down resistance among POWs. It helped seed post-war Germany with individuals who understood both the material reality of American production and the systems that made it possible. These former prisoners would become some of the strongest advocates for democratic capitalism during Germany's crucial post-war reconstruction. The broader implications of these supermarket encounters extended into Cold War geopolitics. When the Berlin blockade began in 1948, many West Germans who had served as POWs in America understood the airlift as a demonstration of the same productive capacity they had witnessed. Former POW Hans Keller, who had worked in a Chicago warehouse during his captivity and later became a city administrator in West Berlin, remarked, "The Americans aren't just flying in supplies. They're flying in their economic system." The impact was perhaps most clearly visible in the divergent development of East and West Germany after the war. While Soviet models were imposed in the East, the West embraced market economics heavily influenced by American examples. Former POWs who had witnessed American abundance firsthand often served as cultural translators, helping their communities understand new economic practices. Historian Elizabeth Heinemann's 2018 study, Witness to Abundance: German POWs and Post-War Economic Memory, documented over 200 former prisoners who went on to play significant roles in West Germany's economic administration, from local chambers of commerce to federal economic ministries. Their formative economic education, Heinemann wrote, came not in universities, but in American grocery stores, factories, and farms. They had seen what worked, and they were determined to replicate it. Harper's Grocery continued serving the community until 1972, when it was eventually replaced by a larger supermarket on the town's outskirts. Ironically, one with the airplane hangar dimensions that had seemed so implausible to Friedrich Müller in 1944. The building that housed the original store still stands, now a community center where, occasionally, the story is told of the day when German prisoners of war discovered that their Reich never had a chance. The contrast could not have been more stark. While German civilians endured severe rationing, with daily caloric intake falling below 1,500 calories by 1944, American civilians maintained a wartime diet averaging over 3,000 calories daily. By 1945, Germany's transport system had collapsed, and food distribution had become critically compromised in major cities and rural areas alike, while America's vast network continued functioning with only minor inconveniences despite the enormous demands of global war. The statistics tell the story. By 1944, American factories were producing a new merchant ship every single day, a new aircraft every 5 minutes, and more military equipment than all Axis powers combined. Perhaps most tellingly, American farms increased production by 38% between 1939 and 1944 despite a significant labor shortage, while German agricultural output fell by nearly 40% during the same period. These numbers reflected the reality that prisoners like Muller had witnessed firsthand in the aisles of Harper's Grocery, a reality that would ultimately determine the outcome of the war regardless of tactical brilliance or heroism on the battlefield. The psychological impact of this productive disparity cannot be overstated. As military historian Stephen Ambrose noted, German soldiers had been raised with the belief in their nation's technical and organizational superiority. The visible evidence of American abundance destroyed this myth more effectively than any battlefield defeat. For the prisoners of Camp Sheridan, the realization came not through propaganda, but through the simple experience of stocking shelves in a small-town grocery store. In the mundane details of American civilian life, the casual shopping, the variety of goods, the decentralized distribution system, the abundance amid wartime, they glimpsed the true nature of the conflict and its inevitable conclusion. The story of how German POWs discovered America's overwhelming productive advantage through exposure to ordinary supermarkets represents one of the most effective psychological operations of the war, not because it was designed as such, but precisely because it wasn't. The truth, displayed on grocery shelves across America, required no embellishment or exaggeration to make its powerful point. In his final diary entry before repatriation, Friedrich Müller wrote, "Germany lost this war not on the battlefields, but on the factory floors and farm fields of America. We were defeated not primarily by American soldiers, but by American farmers, factory workers, and shopkeepers, by the system that could fill a small-town grocery store with more abundance than I had seen in Germany since before the war. This is the lesson I take home. The strength of a nation lies not in its military might alone, but in its productive capacity and the systems that harness it." And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.